so thrilled to be here today. In Australia, you guys, to me, have the best of the U.S. without the U.S., so it's always a pleasure. So what I want to do today is kind of riff on a couple issues that I think are resonant with some of the issues that Jill has been championing, but also I'm going to be working with Selena Griffiths, who's here in the design department as well. So it's a real pleasure to be in the same room as Doug Kahn as well. I'm a huge fan of his writing. If you haven't checked out his books, they're amazing. So, okay, here we are in 2013, and you guys are about to have a crazy election coming up, right? And one of the things that always strikes me about politics is that it's a funny, kind of very ambiguous space where people's values no longer necessarily reflect anything having to do with reality. So here we are in 2013, where the idea of realism and the idea that somehow data aesthetics have somehow, if you're in the U.S. and you're talking to a Republican about climate change, it's like, I couldn't think of a better joke saying, put two Republicans in a science lab and see what happens. But what I want to do today is not only talk about sound and art, but from the viewpoint of a sense of irreverence and how people think about creativity and design with digital media. So, first up, I'm in the middle of finishing up a residency at the Metropolitan Museum in New York, which is an amazing spot because it's one of the largest flagship museums in the United States. The Met gave me access to their entire archive for a year season, and the idea was to remix the museum. So what I wanted to do today was walk you guys through some current projects and some historical ones. So first up, the Met in the U.S. essentially has over 20 million objects under its control in their archive. It has about 19 different curatorial departments and occupies several million square feet of Central Park. So it's one of the largest museums in the U.S., and the New York Times recently just did a large feature on the work. The fun part about the Met and thinking of the idea of remixing a museum is essentially that architecture, and if you think about the archive, the Met is kind of one of these places that has an iconic relationship to New York. So the idea was to apply DJ technique to how people thought of an archive. So the idea was to go through the museum, look at the objects, and generate compositions. So whenever I do a kind of residency or art project, half the battle is research. One of the things I found with the Met was that it was radically overwhelming because there was a tremendous amount of objects. So being able to take over a museum and be able to remix it implies a couple things. One, the idea of architecture, and two, the idea of the instability of a composition. Because you're looking at, I'll give you an example. One of my favorite composers, Mussorgsky, is a Russian composer who has a piece called Portraits at an Exhibition. And that's considered to be one of the first compositions to think about moving through a museum. So you have a sense of procession, you have a sense of being able to engage in archive, and above all, you have a sense of how the dynamic engagement with art generates music. So later composers like Scriabin, or for that matter, John Cage, all approach the idea of looking at architecture and design from the viewpoint of patterns. John Cage is usually considered to be the first person to write compositions for turntables. So in 1939, he wrote a piece called Imaginary Landscape. So with the Met, what I did was say, okay, if you guys have 19 curatorial divisions, something like over 20 million objects, let's think about this as the idea of the museum. Because there's no way I could actually generate compositions unless I set up an algorithm to go through the entire archive and then make it just become a huge abstraction, which some people would do. So, with that said and done, what I ended up doing was breaking the residency into 5 sections, each section dealing with certain thematics. So one was about environmental issues, the other was about sort of economics, the other was about sort of historical archival materials that overall, kind of reflected some of the stuff, and then so on and so on. And we had a series of concerts and happenings. So one of the last ones was called Of Water and Ice, and I ended up doing that as an open source project, because the idea is no one owns water, no one owns ice. And museums are about pulling things out of circulation in a culture. They're about creating a dead space, essentially where you look at an object that's divorced from its context. So what I wanted to do was look at water and ice as sort of metaphors for how we can really think about instability of an object. There's a very famous phrase from the poet Schiller, who simply says, architecture is nothing but frozen music. So if we remix that phrase and do a little bit of wordplay, we can say music is nothing but liquid architecture. So going through a project where I took a studio to Antarctica, and I'll just show you really quick because I think it's always good to be visual. And one of the things that really struck me when I was there, this is me hanging out, it's a very cold day. The fun part about going to Antarctica was there's no people. There's only about 2,000 people on the entire continent, and they're all scientists. So I love scientists, super cool. But the situation for me was looking at scale, and people really couldn't get how big these objects were. So I started thinking more and more about how people would respond to landscape. So part of that project as a composition was to do research, and we eventually had the concert at the Met, and I'll just show you what it looked like. But I'm going to go a little non-linear because we're going to the end of that project versus the beginning. So imagine you walk into a room, and the whole room is essentially drenched in this kind of light that is generated by ice. And I'll just show you what that looks like for a second in two contexts. One, we had it at Sundance, and it was hosted by Robert Redford, who's a very renowned actor. And when you walked into the room, I had hundreds of screens playing different kinds of ice. And the fun part about that is that ice is a very geometric form. And so you can get to kind of an algorithmic process. And eventually, that became a batch of compositions and a book. And then I played the book at the Met. So this is already getting more and more interdisciplinary. So the idea was to do some research about the history of the project. And I ended up finding out a couple things. One, there's me hanging out with a lot of penguins. Penguins smell terrible. But then going through the landscape and trying to figure out scale, one of the things that I felt with music was that people couldn't get a sense of scale until they saw other people. And then you realize how big this place is and how a composition reflecting that would have to generate something looking at patterns overall, because the idea here of a landscape and a composition being presented in a museum is what was the goal. So I started doing more research, and this is what they call ice core sampling. So in Antarctica, they dig down into the ice and essentially are able to tell what was in the air 10 million years ago, 5 million years ago, and so on. So it's like sampling a record. And as you dig down into the layers of sediment, you can easily see striation. And actually, you can think of the Earth itself as an archaeological record. So what happens if you play the ice? One of my favorite theoreticians of this is a gentleman by the name of Johannes Kepler. In 1611, he was on his way home, and a snowflake landed on his sleeve, and he was stunned by the geometry of the ice. And he went home and wrote this very famous essay called Six Sides of a Snowflake. And it's one of the first rigorous mathematical treatises looking at science applied to nature in the form of geometry and math. So, interestingly enough, those equations go straight into digital media, and I was able to look at it from the viewpoint of an algorithmic process, and to research more and more about the geometry of ice. And you can easily see an algorithmic process at work, and a kind of fractal layering going on. And the natural beauty of this is that mathematics and geometry are expressed in the material in a pure form. You can easily see a hexagonal shape that completely continues to refigure and over and over. So you call this a recursive pattern. And the stunning beauty of nature is that it's about patterns at every level. So if you go from the macro level to the micro, you can easily see how scientists have been exploring this. But as a composer, I was really interested in this idea of pattern recognition as a basic compositional tool. So, me being African American, we also, black people, we love ice. So you have to remember, a lot of hip hop MCs will call themselves, Ice-T, Ice Cube. If you got the white guy, you got Vanilla Ice. So this is Iceberg Slim, and he's considered to be one of the originators of hip hop. So the metaphor of the cold motherfucker is kind of a very funny kind of hit wordplay in hip hop. But it also has a metaphorical, Freudian situation where you say this is the tip of the iceberg, all puns intended. So if you go from that to that, you can see a poetry, a sociology, a sense of scientific presentation of a material. And then, when I was presenting the project, I was looking at other patterns. This is what they call a shepherd's tone, and you can easily see the symmetry in the tone form. So this is another influence on the project, which is Marshall McLuhan. So the idea was to take the medium of ice and then make it generate sound patterns. And this is in what ice's normal molecular form is like as well. So very rigorous mathematics and then sense of humor. The piece was curated into the Guangzhou Biennial by this gentleman. His name's Ai Weiwei. He's a very renowned Chinese artist. And when he was curating the Guangzhou Biennial, I said, hey, Paul, I've been hearing about this Antarctica project. Let's present it in Guangzhou. So from the Met to Guangzhou, it was still an art composition, but it was still very much about dynamic engagement with a medium. So here's me at the Guangzhou Biennial. We had these trucks kind of set up these large-scale screens, and you can see the cranes. That's me at the bottom. We were setting it up, and these cranes are moving portable screens. And we had about 10,000 people come to the show. It's me DJing with a string quartet and projecting all this different kinds of ice. And so what was beautiful about that evening, what was also kind of scary, is that Ai Weiwei didn't show up for the opening because he had been captured by Chinese secret police at the airport. So we were all waiting for him, and he didn't show up because he was in a secret prison. So the intriguing thing about geopolitics, about environmental issues, about design is it's never separated from reality of the current political economy. So that's one project, and let me just show you what it ended up looking like at the Met as well, just to give you a sense of proportion. The book is called this, The Book of Ice, and again, the tip of the iceberg is a kind of metaphor here, Freudian. But for this project, going to the Met, it ended up being called Of Water and Ice. I'll just show you really quickly. So here's me sampling a string quartet through my iPad software and being able to take all of the motifs and elements that the musicians are playing and then generating beats and elements from that. And it came to Australia as well in the Melbourne Festival a little while ago. So let me just show you. I think it's always good to show examples. So this gentleman here, his name is Wagner, was an architect and composer, and he coined the term Gesamtkunstwerk, which essentially means total artwork. For him, sound and architecture and patterns were not separate. And he's a big influence on my work because he also helped sort of foster this idea of nature and romanticism. And I would consider my music as sort of anti-romantic, but more looking at scientific data, or data aesthetics. So if we go to him, to Schoenberg, to Stravinsky, you can start thinking about what happens with the act of sampling as a détournement, or pulling apart of the idea of these sort of revered composers and pulling them apart into a kind of world of hip-hop and techno and dubstep and so on. So this is a amusing situation. When you think about perspective, which I always like to try and put yourself in the other person's shoes, sampling says, let's pull apart the perspective that you are listening to a found sound, that you are listening to something that is a culturally received and culturally conditioned context. So you have an uneasy tension between context and content. So I always use this as a funny example of when people perceive the other from a different point of view. So if we remix these two, you can easily kind of start thinking of, I'll just show you a kind of amazing remix for a second. Okay, so we were talking about remixing, we were talking about collage, we're talking about appropriation, and above all, the sense that the everyday person is looking at sound as a found situation. So this is one remix. This is one of my favorite musicians, George Clinton. He does Parliament Funkadelic, and he had my iPad app. So it's an interesting situation because Parliament Funkadelic is one of the most sampled bands in history. Dr. Dre, 50 Cent, Snoop Dogg, etc. They all go back to him. So I was at South by Southwest, and he's like, "You're the one that made that app." And I was like, "Yeah." So this is the app, and basically all the stuff I'm showing you guys is free. I'm a very big fan of the idea of open source culture, and I developed this. There's the generic version, which is just called DJ Mixer, and then this is the more customized version. So it's on the iTunes store, and so is my books and so on. But I was thinking about graphic design and record cover sleeves, and the idea of the interface. So you can take your record crates tab, and you have this idea of post playlist, and be able to pull in all the bits and pieces of various parts of your record collection and assign it to turntables. So I'll just... collage and then the idea of the record cover sleeve is quite interesting because you're tying sound to memory. Now, my most recent books are with MIT Press. The last book was called Sound Unbound, and I'll just show you that really quickly. Sound Unbound, I had about 30 different essays by 30 different theoreticians talking about sound, art, and digital media. So what I ended up doing was getting people like Pierre Boulez, Brian Eno, Steve Reich, wrote the introduction, Moby, Vijay Iyer, who's a very renowned Indian composer. I also got the senior legal counsel at Google. Her name is Daphne Keller. She's a rock star lawyer. We had the launch at Google's corporate headquarters, and she made all the other executives at Google buy the book, which was kind of fun. And so the idea was, all right, out of all of this, one of the favorite people that I tracked down was the guy who invented the record cover sleeve. I'll just show you what he looks like, because I think it's important to... There we go. So Alex Steinweiss, one day, will be remembered as probably one of the more important visualists. This is him in his studio. And what's interesting is that he's considered to be the inventor of the record cover sleeve. So whenever you go into a record store, you're essentially being bombarded with visual material that is encoded with sound and sound memory. So if you think about some of the earlier record cover sleeves that he designed, the graphic design is very much a crucial component of getting people to think about what the sound looks like. So he went into RCA Victor one day and said, why don't we put an image on the record cover sleeve? And amusing enough, in the history of graphic design, record cover sleeves used to be blank. So that created a huge revolution in graphic design that lingers with us to this day. And if you just click back, you can easily see it becomes apps. So when you start thinking about what is an app, you're essentially looking at something that is about a tactile creative space where you're touching and interacting with data. Now, a record is usually considered to be something that's a document. But with these kind of materials, you're looking at more and more moving into a 21st century relationship to data aesthetics. So I've developed a series of apps, one of which, the DJ Spooky one, that one we've had over 15 million downloads, and it's been quite popular, it's a DJ Mixer thing. And what I wanted to do when I was starting the project was to look at interface as an inheritor of somehow what people had thought about with the record. So everything I'm showing you guys today is free, by the way. And if you start thinking about what is a turntable and a permutation machine, you're able to easily play elements, collage, loop, layer, and sample. So that's a practice of discourse. It's not just about sound. It's about the way sound changes. So when we worked with iTunes, I also released the book project that I did on Google Play and all of the major apps operating systems. So 1 second. And so the book of Ice that I was talking about earlier, all of these are apps and ebooks, but they're also physical books. And the pun here is that you're looking at dematerialization, you're looking at digital media, but you're also looking at a composer using research to dig into what we think about with data aesthetics. So these are the places I went in Antarctica. And if you actually go to the chapter headings, each chapter has hidden chapters that lead you to these QR code prints that take you to hidden websites. And I'll just show you really quick. So I always think of a composition as kind of unfolding in a way that you have to easily think about dimensionality. So say, for example, if I click on this really quick, it pulls you into all these different loops and layers, all of which are playable by string quartet. And the graphic design of this project was presented at the Metropolitan Museum, and it's gone to a whole bunch of different museums and galleries and biennials. So that's one of the most recent projects. And the sound components, again, are all released under Lawrence Lessig's Creative Commons. It's a really interesting group out of Harvard. So now I want to show you another project that I think might be resonant with you guys, which is a film I just did the score to called Downloaded. It's narrated by Sean Parker and Sean Fanning. These two gentlemen here. Sean Fanning, the gentleman on the right, he started what we call Napster. And Sean Parker on the left was one of the co-founders of what we call Facebook. He funded and worked with Mark Zuckerberg. And when he was at Harvard, Mark Mark Zuckerberg, essentially. I don't know if you guys saw the movie, The Social Network. But I'll just play this because I think it's good to give you a sense of context and give you a sense of style of what the music sounds like. Just take a moment. You're talking about revolutionizing the way we use computers. The fact that you can kind of share emotion over the internet, something so important to you, you can just trade so freely. That's what was so profoundly different about the explosion of the internet, was that it was one network. So suddenly you could be connected to everyone. I released an early beta version of the Napster software during the summer, and it spread quickly by word of mouth. It hasn't stopped growing since. Just wanted to create a way to meet people through music. Music will be ubiquitous, and we believe you'll be able to get it on your cell phone. You'll be able to get it on whatever the device of the future is. We knew it was a long way off from all the music being available digitally, and then there was. I just thought that was one of the great moments in human history.
This is a company that is building a business. They put venture capital money.
It's possible to invest in it. Don't take the money. You don't have a business.
They're building a business of facilitating the stable artist music.
We saw the clicks of the numbers. That's what they were doing. That was shocking.
Music business is a great example of just complacency being total death sentence.
I thought that the way that people got music over the last 50 years worked. I'm not adjusting to technology. Major music industry's entire phones were turning the lights off. Yeah, that's great.
The talent that was coming to our office, what we're really doing is giving back to the information that they thought that we couldn't get.
There's no still straight up. I'm too different.
This last fall semester rolled on. That brings up the Curating and millions of programs spreading across college campuses went wildfire. Nearly 60 million people use the site to swap music files from each other's computers for free.
We literally went from being high school kids leading normal mundane lives to 12 months later bringing one of the largest U.S. industries to its knees and basically fighting what is the largest corporate lawsuit in the history of the world.
Lawyers representing Napster and the recording industry squared off before a 3-judge panel.
What is it capable of being used? So we are not trying to stop the internet, sir.
The final word on Napster will eventually end up coming from the U.S. Supreme Court.
Yes, and downloaders beware, the recording industry is suing computer users.
What they've done is to turn an entire generation of kids into electronic basketball.
And nobody knew what the hell was happening.
It has changed everything. It's obviously so big, it's out of their control.
The cat wasn't going back in the bag.
Now people have a choice.
There's no stopping. This revolution has already taken place.
So when I composed music, what I was doing was looking at the film, and then we had it narrated with people like Dr. Dre, Metallica, David Bowie, all these different folks who basically had been against social media and music. It was kind of interesting to find them 10 years later and say, what do you think now? But Dr. Dre particularly had a favorite phrase. He was going to hire hit squads to kill I couldn't make this up. But the fun part about doing a score for this film, I don't think it's been released here yet. It'll be out in about a month. You'll see it in movie theaters and so on. Is that we got some of the key figures of the last 10 years social media movement to think about sound and the internet. And so for me as an artist, these are people who I think are very influential, but they're also intriguing figures to sample. So I composed the score for this film based on everyone's narrative, then remixed it and edited it together to have a continuous kind of mixtape feel. The soundtrack for this is available for free online. Everything's open source and Creative Commons license and so on. So that's one project that's probably between that and the iPad app are the most popular. The album that I presented with the Met, for example, I put it out a couple weeks ago, and we've had over 500,000 plays in a very short amount of time. And so again, these are all quite popular in an American context and slowly filtering over to Australia and other places. So as a composer and artist, these are things that reflect directly on this idea that the network system of the web is part of my compositional archive. How I think about sampling and sounds is the connectivity of it all. So let me just show you one other example that I'm going to get into the Vanuatu project. For example, the Antarctica one, we ended up having it go to several contexts. And I always think it's a good thing to show how a composer can exist in radically different contexts. For example, it's not every day you have a DJ go to Antarctica. So what we ended up doing was work with the Sci-Fi Channel in the US and did a series of vignettes about climate change. And we eventually had it on mainstream TV. By the way, like I'm saying, everything's free. I'll just show you a quick clip of what it ends up looking at on mainstream TV. So,
let's imagine that things you see every day in nature actually contain secret sounds. DJ Spooky went to Antarctica, and where others heard silence, he heard music. He took the visual patterns of the melting continent and created a living symphony. You've heard that the environment is changing, but you've never heard it like this. DJ Spooky, Imagine Greater. Your turn. Go to let'simagine.greater.com.
So kids will be watching stuff like Battlestar Galactica or, crazy science fiction TV shows, and then all of a sudden these TV commercials would come up with like melting polar caps and penguins breakdancing in the middle of Manhattan and stuff like that. So actually it was quite popular as these kind of vignettes showing the context of climate change, but in a medium that people could get it. Because sometimes I tend to find that with lefty progressive narratives, people want to beat you over the head or make you feel like you're eating broccoli or stuff that's unappealing. But you have to be able to reach people where they are. So you can't tell them where they should go. You should deal with them where they are. So much of my work has gone through the process of trying to understand pop culture and remix it and sample it to what I view as messages that I can convey through a literary context. So those are certain projects that have all unfolded in museums, in galleries, on TV, on the web. And above all, they explore the idea that the studio is the world. If you go back in time to the 19th century model of the studio, it was divorced from if a painter or a sculptor, etc., would go to a remote place. It was meant to be all about this idea that the studio was withdrawn from reality. And for composers, it was a similar situation as well. For me, the realm of the remix has opened up immense amounts of possibility in cultural exchange. And that leads us to two things. One, the Vanuatu and Nauru projects, and then the other is this idea that the role of the composer has evolved radically beyond anything that would have been imaginable in the 20th century. So if you go back to 1915, this is considered to be one of the first sound systems. One of my favorite early composers is a gentleman by the name of Luigi Russolo, and he wrote this book in 1915 called The Art of Noise. So at that time, this was a radical gesture. People would throw bottles at him, they were saying, play music, and you can imagine who won because you're hearing my voice through all the speakers. So essentially, the avant-garde and pop culture have always been in tandem. It's just like one of my favorite science fiction writers, William Gibson, says, it's essentially that the future is already here. It's just unevenly distributed. So that's sampling. You take a horn riff from 1920, a bass line from 1915, a drum roll from 1927, you put it all together, and you have Wu-Tang Clan. So the pun here is not only an acoustic metaphor for how culture works, but you have to really start thinking about the remix as a basic global vernacular. And this is the picture I was looking for earlier. It's a remix of Bush and Obama. And the idea here is that you have a visual collage. This is kind of the Photoshop imagination. And the eerie thing about the way sampling and the seamlessness of a collage, and at this point in digital media, is that editing itself is an art form. So when you start thinking about what that means in a geopolitical context, what it means is essentially that data itself is now the new palette. So what I was doing with the data about, I'll just show you really quickly again, looking at this idea of algorithmic form, you can easily see permutation of hexagonal form from water. So I took that mathematics and was able to derive geometric forms and shapes directly correlating to ice, but based strictly on the mathematical representation. So when you start thinking about that as the basic sense of geometry, data, I'll show you again really quickly. Historical photo, like a painting like this, The Wanderer Above Fog. This was meant to be about romanticism and using the environment to show the person above, the statues of all these other rocks and formations, and above all, the idea that the reason of the 19th century was about dominating nature, and being above nature was the theme of the German situation in the 19th century. Amusingly enough, these forms of German expressionism, German romanticism, eventually led to, Hitler being one of the most control-oriented individuals. And later, anything that was mixed and hybrid was called Untautete Kunst, which simply means degenerate art. So this is a fun remix here. You can see it's African with a Star of David playing a saxophone. And so this collage was about an anti-utopian vision for people like Hitler. Now, that is the origins of what we think about the conflict of modernism and then postmodernism. Control of different ideas of purity and control of different ideas of hybridity. Which one wins? Now, intriguingly enough, the Third Reich and its sense of control of imagery of totalitarian approaches to culture failed miserably. But if we start thinking about the Soviet model and about the Western capitalist model that comes after World War II, you can see there's an eerie sense of totalitarian work at play with standardizing people's sense of time, duration, and above all, rhythm. Amusingly enough, say for example, if I were to ask most of you, your average hip-hop beat is in 4/4 tempo, very specific relationships to time and duration, house music, techno, dubstep. One could easily argue that the standardization of rhythm is now something that we all face, which one could argue at that time was a different agenda. So, as an artist, these things interest me, and I like the idea of disruption, of the glitch, of imperfection, what the Japanese would call wabi-sabi. Now, amusing enough, some of the other projects I'm doing that relate to islands go straight to this idea of colonial networks. So I'm going to just show you quickly the Nauru project. How are we for time? Is maybe another 10 minutes, 5 minutes? All right. Okay, just one time. Okay. So Australia has a strange relationship to Nauru, and so do I. I went to Nauru as a project that eventually played at the Gwangju Biennial as well, that was curated by Ai Weiwei and a very renowned Korean architect named Song Hae-sun. But Nauru is an island that's the world's smallest republic. And this project went to a whole bunch of different biennials as well. And this year, I'm currently in the Venice Biennial. Let me just show you that project because I think they're two related islands. And for the 50th Pavilion, 50th Venice Biennial, I did this project analyzing the ocean currents around the Maldives, which are going to be the first islands to sink. And so the composition generated from that essentially takes you through this idea of data zonification. So that was called tide and tariff. And I'm calling it an adagio, which in classical music vernacular means is sort of an elegy. So Nauru, on the other hand, is the world's smallest republic. And what was interesting about Nauru is that essentially it brought the Soviet Union to its knees. Again, the Cold War, 1989, when the Berlin Wall fell, hundreds of billions of dollars started vanishing from Russia, the Soviet Union, and going to Nauru. And intriguingly enough, this was the first reflection of global electronic banking and hackers and stuff like that. So I read some really intriguing articles about offshore banking and the way that reflects in networks and hubs with islands. So the Cayman Islands, Nauru, Monaco, Luxembourg, and so on. Switzerland, of course, being kind of an inland island. Now, Nauru, it's a remote and very heavy place. In fact, the Australian government has sort of taken over and has made it into a prison colony for refugees. So I took a studio there and started going around the island and started doing a lot of research, as I normally do. And this is the world's smallest republic, so it's sort of anti-utopia. Now, the term utopos means place of nowhere, and it was an island that was a metaphor for the idea of perfectibility of society. Now, Nauru, on the other hand, is a very dystopian, very heavy-handed place that's been mined by the Australians to the point that it's a devastated moonscape. So the idea was to do compositions reflecting this environmental catastrophe. And let me just show you what it ended up looking like. Everything on the island's rusted and falling apart. There's these huge ruins of the Nauru Phosphate Corporation. This is a massive structure that the Australians were using to extract resources and materials. Everything is collapsing and falling apart. So I went and put cameras up on this, went throughout it, was looking at how the impact of ecological catastrophe and governance collapse at the same time. And what was incredible about it is that the place had been occupied by the Japanese during World War II as well. This is Japanese bunkers. Then the Americans came through and bombed everything, and you can see that everything even melted into the ground. So this is, pillbox bunkers, ruins. That's the ruins of the presidential palace. So it's a place that's kind of they have an epidemic of obesity at the moment. Massive corruption and a collapse of the nation state's governance policies, unstable constitutional stuff. Lots of churches, very few people, and all the money from these kinds of quote-unquote corruption and so on ended up going to Australia at 80 Collins Street in Melbourne. There's a massive skyscraper. So, eerily enough, this is a really intriguing reflection of the ruins of empire, the confetti of these fragmented collapses of not only the Soviet Union, but the British Empire, the Japanese Empire, Australian corporate depredation. So, looking at all the metaphors and, of course, ecological collapse, the island is also sinking. So, these are pretty good metaphors for our current moment. This project is still touring. It's a group of string quartet works that I wrote called the Nauru Elegies, and it's metaphorical, but also very related to the materiality of ecological devastation. And I'll just show you what it looks like for a moment. I'm sampling a string quartet through my iPad software on this. And we had a premiere in Australia at the Experiment by there's all these people on stage. They're being channeled through an iPad that I'm looping and layering, so it sounds like there's a lot more people. And it's meant to be a kind of symphonic work, looking at iPad software and string quartet. So these projects have been quite popular. I've had them play at large-scale biennials and all sorts of spots. One of the wildest places that I got to do a concert in was, I'll show you really quickly. I got the rights to D.W. Griffith's film Birth of a Nation and presented that. We got the Greek government to give me the Acropolis for an evening. And we projected Birth of a Nation throughout the ruins and at the Herod Atticus Theater. And we had about 5,000 people come out to that show. And I said, hi everybody, thanks for coming to the show. I think I'm the first DJ to play here in a couple of thousand years. So there's some fun stuff at work here, but it's also very serious about theoretical exploration and historical appropriation. But the metaphor of a DJ remix of some of the most iconic architecture in the West, the Acropolis, with the projection of D.W. Griffith's film Birth of a Nation, we can name nationalism, impermanence, history. These are all things that inspire my work with sampling. So imagine this idea of a nonlinear kind of project of one of the most, the Greeks were like, why do you want to play this crazy racist film at the Acropolis? And I was like, well, you guys are great. You got comedy, tragedy. And then I'm like, oh, I get it. So, interesting enough, with DJ culture, Birth of a Nation is this crazy KKK film. And I'll just play you a quick clip. And then one last example, and we'll jump. So these are non-linear. These are going to projects that have been over the last couple of years. Interestingly enough, when you start looking at islands and architecture, because that's essentially Griffith is one of the people that I think set up the system of Hollywood. So the representation of stuff that would essentially be a mainstream or not so mainstream you have to imagine that the Hollywood system created many of the ideas of role playing and so on that we still respond to. So utopia, dystopia, and the idea of perception. Now, there's a lot of examples that I could go into about why islands, but I want to just show you really quickly the Vanuatu project to get, and then we'll open up to questions. So I first heard about Vanuatu as end result of a series of essays I was reading when I was looking at Nauru. Now, interesting that the architecture in Vanuatu is usually woven by hand, and it's based on palm leaves, bamboo, and so on. So I was reading about the end of Nauru as this kind of place sinking beneath the sea, sort of anti-utopian. And then Vanuatu I'd heard about because it's considered by this group of economists who have been studying what they call the happiness index. Vanuatu, it's consistently been placed as what they call the happiest place on Earth. So from Nauru, I jumped on a flight and went down to Vanuatu, and was looking at the architecture and the design, and think this is an island office. And the fun part about the opposites that this represents to Nauru, which is global finance, depredation, the destruction of entire biosystems, the nation sinking to the waves, is that Vanuatu is quite a green and verdant place. And it's this kind of very few people. And amusing enough, when I was there, I was hiking, checking out different kinds of architecture and design for my project. And I ended up meeting, I was editing some tracks sitting on a beach. And these kids come up to me, and they're like, "What is that?" I'm like, "What do you mean?" And they're like, they had never seen an iPad before. So a couple days later, I get a query from Chief Kapun. He's the chief of the main island on Tana. And they're like, "Chief Kapun wants to meet you, and bring that iPad." So next thing you know, we get in a Jeep, and we go through these jungle roads to the middle of Tana Island. And Tana is an interesting spot in that it's the heart of what they call cargo cults. So in World War II, the U.S. occupied Vanuatu to fight the Japanese, and what ended up happening, the indigenous people copied the American soldiers, and so they would actually create uniforms and so on to look like the American soldiers, and because they're Melanesian culture, they have a cult called John Frum. Now, Vanuatu is also very famous in that it started what we call bungee jumping. I'll just show you really quickly what that looks like. What they'll do is they'll jump off these large-scale structures. And again, because I'm very interested in architecture, I'm showing you the design of it. And they'll make these kind of structures that essentially are a social process where the youth build, create, and then jump off of them. So these guys from New Zealand came to these islands and saw this ritual. It's a ritual for warriors to jump and show that they have no fear. So the structure is a social condensation of all these processes, and then they have to jump off of it. And they tie vines to their ankles, and if they don't die, then they're happy. So intriguingly enough, the Economist magazine, a whole bunch of other magazines have been looking at Vanuatu as the happiest place on Earth because the variables that go into the happiness index were based on what they call intangible goods, the idea of quality of life. What happens to a culture that is not producing physical goods? Say, for example, if you're looking at China or the industrial economies of all of these Asian countries, is that it's based on what they call GDP, gross domestic product. The more cars you make, the more computers you make, the more your culture is considered to be advanced. But at the same time, that doesn't mean they have good quality of life. So economists are trying to figure out the balance of that. And what I was doing in Vanuatu was looking at percussion instruments. These are what they call talking drums. So sort of original techno. And these drums, they play very large-scale rituals. So I took scans of the drums and started making these kinds of percussion surfaces. And these are large, actually. I just kind of want to give you a sense of scale because it's always good. So when you see the gentlemen playing these, they are playing spirit voices, and they're meant to be these kind of rhythm patterns that reflect different regional concerns. So I studied that and started making CAD designs, and eventually these haven't been made yet. We'll probably end up making them here, come to think of it. But they are percussion instruments that are tunable surfaces. So these are all projects that still deal with patterns, and I'm going to kind of keep referring to the idea of pattern recognition. But from hip-hop to techno to dubstep to reggae, you name it. We live in an era where rhythms, as we think of them as electronic, determine culture. And whether it be global finance or whether it be a hip-hop beat, the idea of pattern recognition is what holds together modern culture. So, as an artist, I'm very interested in collage as a way of breaking down the barriers between the industrial versus post-industrial versus pre-industrial. Because if you really think about it, the idea of the human spirit in the 20th century was about industrialization and people getting standardized life and standardized lifestyle. And for the 21st century, we're now in the era of mass customization, where everyone will have access to material to generate their own take on it. So I think my art reflects that in a way that sampling is saying, this is the new archive, this is the new palette. And we need to start thinking about getting out of the 20th century mentality of industrialization and standardization. And I think that that's something that's probably one of the healthiest things human society can start thinking about, because otherwise we're all going to be like China with massive pollution and everyone, just totally grinding. Now, New York versus China, New York versus Australia, I'm very downtown, and my peer group are people like Sonic Youth or Yoko Ono, or for that matter, in terms of other DJs, people like DJ Shadow or DJ Crush or Cut Chemist. All of them I've worked with or been in concerts or in tandem with. But very few of them do this interdisciplinary take on sampling and collage and this idea of looking at the archive. So with that said and done, I'll wrap up and just wanted to say it's a pleasure being here. And in Vanuatu, we're hoping to set up a kind of nonprofit based on sustainable design. And these are some of the first people I'm inviting out. They're called the Brooklyn Bamboo Collective. And they use bamboo, which is actually quite carbon negative, to create installations and so on. So, for example, we want to do a lab session where people learn how to make their own bicycles. And intriguingly, bamboo is stronger than steel, and you can eat it. So if you've ever had bamboo salad, you're on your carbon negative part. And intriguing enough, if you cut down bamboo, it grows back within a season. But if you cut down wood, it takes hundreds of years to grow back. So during that process, it's pulling a lot of carbon out of the air. So what we're going to be doing here at COFA, probably next year during my residency, we'll be exploring sustainable practices in the arts and thinking about sampling between mediums. So imagine stuff like a solar-powered sound system or a bamboo bicycle and the design components that go into that. So the Vanuatu project is just getting started. I'll just show you really quickly. It's going to be what we call a carbon-negative artist retreat. And I'm looking at stuff like what happened with the Black Mountain College, where you had people like Robert Rauschenberg, John Cage, Morris Cunningham. But what we're going to be doing is taking over a parcel of land and being able to use it as what I call a island innovation lab. So I was just there. We flew a helicopter over the property. It's quite big. There's different zones in it. So there's some areas that are very clear. Others that are there's a bay, for example. Sorry, it's a little blurry, but you can easily see these are it's several hundred hectares, which is quite large. So the idea will be to set up a design lab on this remote place and start thinking about different kinds of creative approaches to interdisciplinary sampling. So it's a lab, it's a studio, and it's about, above all, saying that the discussion between mediums is where I think some of the newer and more robust ideas about contemporary society will be coming out of. So that's the idea of an island.
Paul, fantastic talk. I think, Jill, fantastic that Paul's going to be here with that residency. That's brilliant. Just something that occurred to me, it's not so much a correct question as an observation, but lead to a question, because I'm interested also in bamboo. When you build anything, architecture fundamentally is dealing with tension and compression. And the outer limits of that spectrum of forces are stone and bamboo, because bamboo actually just naturally deals with tension. But what fascinates me about bamboo, and I think it's getting around to what I wanted, the comment that I wanted you to speak to, was that it's a material that actually tells you what to do. There's a lot that many people would argue, and rightly so, that China had like 4,000 years on us because of bamboo. And I'm just fascinated by, not only is it dealing with tension, but it immediately tells you how. If you get it, you chop it, you go, oh, I get it. So a hollow round cylinder is almost as strong as a solid one. then you cut it again. It's a container, or it's a glass. You peel it, it starts to, I can weave it. It's cut me, it's a knife. I mean, it's one of these phenomenal materials that didn't need, if you compare that with a tree, I mean, it's fascinating how it's actually telling you what to do. So that immediate response, I sort of thought there's a direct analogy between that as a material, I think, and the apps that you use. There's something about, we finally reached a point in technology where I would say that the apps are in fact the new bamboo. So it's quite logical to me that you and bamboo sort of go together, but don't forget the apps, because I think they're going to produce, we're at a point where there's going to be a massive acceleration as a result. And the deftness with which you're guiding us into that territory, I think, that's the future.
Well, and just to comment on that, as a response, I mean, the thing about sampling is that it's pulling apart things that you're familiar with. So if you hear a James Brown song, or if you hear a Rolling Stones song, or whatever, familiar, so that's where you get this uncanny effect, where it's essentially your memory is being messed with, And so the beautiful, one of my earliest inspirations was William S. Burroughs, and the nickname is called the Subliminal Kid. It's taken from William S. Burroughs' novel Nova Express. But the interesting thing about what you're saying is building code actually holds back so much of how we think of what could be happening with architecture, because the standardization and the way that, say for example, in Australia you guys use a lot of brick, and that's actually not responsive to the environment here. And in fact, you have to have more electricity and more, things that are not renewable to just keep it cool or to heat it or whatever. Whereas the indigenous people before, the Aboriginals, maybe would have built different kinds of architecture in-house. So what I want to do with the Vanuatu project is show that you can have different dialectical processes, something where why not put people who are super high-tech in the middle of a remote area and see what happens, or for that matter, have them in dialogue. Can I get the projector back up for a second? One of Vanuatu's major traditions, to show you really quick, is what they call sand painting. And pretty interesting. I swung by the National Museum, and the guys who's the head librarian or head curator, they draw these stunningly beautiful patterns in the sand and then blow it away. It's meant to be this impermanence. And interesting enough, every point and intersection on this is a story. So the guy's telling you a story while he's drawing in the sand, and the story is mnemonic, like he's memorized the history of the people or the region. And it was pretty amazing to get the director of a national museum to have a whole sand kind of installation when you walk in the door, and starts showing you the story of the region and the sand, and then when it's finished, he just erases it. So with architecture, it's about permanence. I think the West usually goes for monumentalism and this idea of using those building materials to represent whether it be a Roman Empire or American, skyscraper, etc. But many other cultures have looked at impermanence, and I kind of love stuff like that.
I'm kind of dizzy. I want to ask you sort of from where, I don't know, we probably know each other for 20 years or so. Your first CD was Death in the Light of the Phonograph, which was an article I wrote about Raymond Roussel. So like early 90s or something. My son, when Fran went into labor, she requested Viral Sonata. So I know, and he's 16 years old, so it's at least 16. But I want to ask you about it's odd. I mean, I just spent 10 years writing a book about sound and ecology. It comes into sound ecology and media. But I was like in libraries and not surfing. And in fact, if I have a criterion, I can only write about things that aren't on Wikipedia already. It's like, I think we're at the polar, you, how did you start off in sound? Because that's sort of what it was called, among other things, and end up in ecology right now. Is there something inherent, in what you were doing in the early 90s that somehow there's some germ within that ends up in ecology?
I'm a big fan of when you're thinking about sampling, you have to really go for this building blocks of memory. So if I take a beat or if I take a bass line or a horn riff, it has to work seamlessly. Or you can play with the glitch, make it break in a way that's interesting. But on the other hand, with the imagination, I like to say the imagination is the ultimate renewable resource. And people are recycling and reusing memory and being able to create new experiences. Now, in the 90s, it was all new. And I remember when DJ Shadow, DJ Crush, me, Amon Tobin, everybody was coming out with new electronic rhythms and styles that, didn't really look at words that much. It was mostly instrumental stuff, and you would maybe scratch words over it. But everyone said, why don't you work with more hip-hop MCs? And I'll tell you a funny example of the MC. If you look at Mos Def or Talib Kweli, you're here in Australia, and this is something me and Joe were talking about earlier. There was a record label called Raucous Records in the 90s that was started by James Murdoch, who's Rupert Murdoch's son. It's kind of funny. He dropped out of Harvard and started this experimental hip-hop label. So in the 90s, there was all these people making electronic music that were radically unexpected. Who would guess James Murdoch? By the way, he's now hacking your cell phone probably as we speak. So the pun here is that there was a moment in culture where people were using devices, computers and machines and so on, in unintended ways. So if you were going to take an electronic sound, it wasn't expected that you would make beats and all of a sudden start a party or something. It was more like, also the same thing with record players. Like Thomas Edison never felt that, he was like, why would anyone ever want to play back a sound? In fact, records were meant to be recorders. So there's always these accidental uses of materials, or unexpected. So for me as an artist, in the 90s, I was never planning on doing music. I did my first gallery shows with Jeffrey Deitch and with Anita Noze, and was, planning on going straight into the sound art kind of scene. And there's people like Christian Barclay, et cetera. But I didn't the art world can't deal with beats. I don't know what it is. They just really, it has to be like squeaky noises. And so, the art world was very resistant to beats. They just, they just couldn't deal with it. So for me, it was more fun and more renewing to do more social events and stuff like that. So when I did 2 degrees, one in philosophy, the other in French literature. And when I graduated from Bowdoin College in May, it's the little Ivies, Bowdoin, Bates, Oakland, Wesleyan, Haverford, Swarthmore, stuff like that. When I graduated, I was writing for Art Forum and the Village Voice, doing music criticism and art criticism. But you couldn't pay the bills. New York's very expensive. So I started throwing rent parties while I was working on my art. And those rent parties became really popular. If you charge somebody $5 at the door to get in, your rent's paid in one night. And, you can't make a living off of writing an article in Art Forum where you spend a month maybe on an article and you get $300 or something. So those events became happenings in the same way that I was looking at John Cage and Robert Rauschenberg. And that's where I felt that there was a really good linkage between how people thought about social process and people like Namjoon Pike and projection and lighting and stuff like that, like parties and events. But, I was like, when is this party going to stop? And it's now 2013, so a lot later. So you guys are hearing the art mix today. It was kind of, it's a weird thing because I was never planning on doing music.
How did you end up in Antarctica? How did you end up in sort of ecological things? Because it's not, like you said, it's not where a lot of DJs end up.
Yeah, DJing usually is people just rocking out and getting drunk or whatever, So. I never was planning on doing music, so it was always meant to be a conceptual art project. And environmental stuff had been a component of my work for many years because of the sound of the city. The city is not, many people separate the city from ecological issues, but to me that's a very big mistake because we have to think of the city as a seamless engagement with the ecosystems that surround it. So music and hip hop and pattern recognition and all that kind of stuff was meant to be very much about the core of the city. But amusing enough, over the course of years, I was like, everyone's experiences are getting more and more and more standardized by the urban dynamic. So I wanted to pose an experiment to myself to see what would happen if I took a studio out of my familiar terrain of the city. And I'm DJing all over the world for the last 15 plus years, going to places like Tokyo, Berlin, Beijing, Mumbai, Sydney, you name it, for the last several years. And the thing you keep noticing is that there's more and more and more standardization of rhythm, house music, techno, dubstep, you name it. So I wanted to pose a question to myself: if this is the new environment, the information environment, what's the most remote part of that? And that's where I decided to go to Antarctica. And a year and a half ago, I went to the North Pole, and then going to Vanuatu and Nauru, some of the most remote places, to see what would happen. And that's so. I think any artist has to pose challenges to themselves, and many people will get very comfortable just doing what they've already done. If it's a painter who's successful painting, I don't know, Julian Shaw, like broken plates or something, or if it's once you get your signature style, you're supposed to just keep doing it forever, which to me is a big mistake, and it means there's a complacency of the imagination. So every couple of years, you should try and challenge yourself, and that's what carrying a backpack and going to Antarctica was.
I'd like to bring it back. I'm fascinated by the actual mechanism. I guess that we're using bamboo as a metaphor. The collage part is a kind of a given in a way for me. It's doing the Schwitters and going to Rosenberg and then postmodernism and then leading out to, we're hungry for appropriation, we're hungry for reinventing things, and you're accelerating that. But you've also adapted a particular, which is also something which is commonly happening, taking a technology and doing something else with it. My own research at the moment is modeling cities in crisis gaming engines, sort of appropriating, like using. So we're also jumping on these things. But the actual, the application system is irresistible with its big bank. It's illustrated that through your talk and your own bank of information. But the app for DJ Spurky in particular, this sort of leading from hip-hop, this sort of two wheels, this irresistible spin against, I'm just fascinated by, that to me is the bamboo. Why is this so irresistible as a mechanism? The double, it's very specific. It's I want to get back to this mechanism and understand it better and why it's grown through culture. But now it could actually make architecture. That's the fascination for me, or change language because it's so accelerated by its memory bank. And it's two circles spinning against each other. What have you really thought about it as, I'm sure you have, as an instrument?
Oh yeah.
Why is it so irresistible? And why is it able to tell you what to do? Even me, Rocker can, I'm sure, open that app and start going. Like it's kind of. Can we talk about the mechanism? Is that
sure? The turntable. No, the turntable is kind of a playback device, but for me, it's more of a permutation device. So you want to change things up. You want to try different approaches because if everybody has the same record, it's boring. So you want to make your own mix, your own version. Now, on the other end of the spectrum, apps. You got to remember the iPad only came out. It came out April 10, 2010, and it's only been 3 years. It radically changed people's relationships to the surface of the screen. So mobile media is now the dominant vocabulary. Everyone has a smartphone. Most people have access to reasonable data rates and so on. Even if you're in the most remote parts of Afghanistan or Antarctica, you more than likely will have access to mobile media in some capacity. So as a DJ, that meant that essentially everyone has access to this archive of records and downloadable files. When I made my iPad app, we were one of the first DJ mixes to get out. I remember we had a launch at the Apple Store in Soho, in New York. We had a line almost 2 blocks long, just to see an app demo. And I was like, wow, this is going to be really popular. But since then, there's been on the iTunes Store, there's been over 50 billion apps downloaded. Google Play is a similar number, for Android apps. So that's more apps than there are human this is just the beginning. So you have to imagine 5 years from now, tablet computers, wearable computers, Google Glass, the interface of the body, how we orient ourselves with GPS and so on. That is very much, I think, the path we're on. But with nature, this is where something probably Jill's been talking about, the Anthropocene era. We're projecting all of our internal things out to these networks that influence and destroy nature. But if we're destroying it and we're part of nature, is that meaning that nature itself is a destructive force in its own right? Which one could argue every major environmental change has been a massive catastrophe, whether it be like rocketing the earth and making the dinosaurs go away, so nature is itself triggered by catastrophes. So there's some people like Tim Flannery, who has a really good book called The Weather Makers. It's a brilliant book about environmental stuff. And there's also a really intriguing book called Cradle to Cradle about design and sustainability. So these are issues I'm using as provocation. Is sound itself an environment? And if so, what about noise? What about noise pollution? What about the idea that the heartbeat and the brain itself, we're making our own rhythms and patterns and so on? So these are meta questions, but they also, I think, reach to the core of what it means to be a digital citizen, because we're participating in an information economy. And it's so important that I think we have to think about literacy right now, like digital literacy.
That's what's fascinating. You're actually now able to sort of riff on this machine and actually build architecture.
Yeah.
And have it model that's it's manufactured from sound. So you're literally, as an architect, you could be just at your desk designing and documenting with music.
Look at Frank Gehry, for example. Frank Gehry's buildings are usually these curved forms and so on, volumetric stuff. Or Bernard Tschumi, Bernard does a series of books called Event Cities, which are quite sharp about movement and urban planning, very compelling. Me and him did a collaboration for the Venice Biennial 2 biennials ago. These are all, I think, buildings that will be changeable. I really think we're going to have to start thinking about multifunctionality, repurposing, remixing, all that kind of stuff is now going to be part of the vernacular of how we think of the buildings we occupy. Because,
Sumi's a really good student of concept situationist, and it's seemingly working back towards perhaps building the vision of unitary urbanism, where there's fluid program within this organism of building. That's what you're talking about.
Yeah, architecture, that's why I kept saying that phrase, architecture. When people say architecture is nothing but frozen music, let's play with that meaning and let's pull it apart and sample and remix it and say music is liquid architecture. It's irreverent. It's something that can change on a dime. It can really go in different directions very quickly. And that's where I think the role of the composer, the role of the architect have come together.
There's a building in London that was melting the Jaguar out on the street. What happened with the Walt Disney Theater in L.A. with the, where Red Cat Theater is?
Yeah.
It was Frank Gehry. That was a Frank Gehry building, but it was like focusing the sun in the apartments across the street and like driving people out of the apartment. So that's the basis of the solar thermal.
No, I love stuff like that.
Power generation. So maybe Frank Gehry can get into some solar thermal. It's just this past week. There's this one building, and anybody see this? Yeah, this one building in London that has been focusing. Well, first of all, there's sun in London, but there has been focusing the light on cars and melting the plastic elements in it.
Well, the funny thing is that would be like some sort of conceptual Yoko Ono piece or something I can imagine. But when I think about a building melting a car, I'm like, that's kind of cool. It would definitely be some crazy art installation. But, there are artists who have influenced some of my work, looking at land art, looking at the project in Vanuatu, the social process of buildings. One of my favorite writers is J.G. Ballard, and he has a book called High Rise, where the angles of the building drive the people who are in the building crazy. It's a brilliant book. If you haven't read J.G. Ballard, I highly recommend it. But with sound, especially in our modern life where we're bombarded with noise at every level, these are things where what would be the acoustic equivalent of the building melting a jaguar instead of melting it would physically with solar. Imagine the sound driving people to. I mean, the U.S. military studies two things right now as the next levels of weapons. One, they're using sound, and they're also using weather. So there's for the Antarctica project, I went to this place called the DARPA, which stands for Defense Advanced Research Programs. And they have this crazy spot up near Dartmouth called the Dartmouth Cold Regions Research Labs. And amazingly enough, they can simulate an entire football field, huge building. I'm not sure if I'm remembering it correctly, but basically they can easily simulate any kind of weather. And they wanted to focus the weather as a weapon. And it's interesting because the way you think about sound and weapons or like frequencies, they actually now use it for crowd control. During the Occupy Wall Street movement, they would send these weird sound cannons to disperse crowds. So this is very much now. And when you're looking at buildings melting cars, that's almost a synesthesia. You know, you're applying these radically unexpected cognitive processes like sun, building, melting car. It's, you know, radically unexpected.
Just one more. I was thinking, you know, with the high score. I was just reading Michel Serres' Natural Contract Revisited, and he talks about the high score that the in prehistoric times the first archaic soot from the first archaic oven in the Middle East ended up on fell in some snow, at high elevation, and they found that signature. So people think it's the Industrial Revolution, but as far as like it's sort of a marker of the carbon footprint of humans, it goes back to this archaic oven in the Middle East. But with global warming, all these if these ice cores are the archive, the Earth archive, and all that's melting, and those is there like a contemporary equivalent for what's going to is this archive that we're building up on the internet and all this recording, is that ever going to melt, or is it prone? Yeah, is it prone to some type of life expectancy?
Any system will crash. Any system. There's imbalances. I mean, one of my favorite movies was The Matrix. The first one, not the first one, but the Agent Smith. It's Mr. Anderson. It's one of my favorite antagonists. Great character. But by the end, he's over-copying himself, and there's too many copies of him, and he's flooding the system with copies. I think that we have to really think about information economy as just one stage, and the next industrial revolution will probably be biotech. Most people are thinking biotech, nanotech. We've poorly used all the resources around us anyway. So next step is nano and all these kinds of different ways of thinking about biological form, biomimesis. So with sound, it's interesting because we get our sense of balance, from what they call the basilar membrane. So imagine if you wake up one day and you don't feel gravity anymore. It's because the basilar membrane is damaged. That's what they call being shell shocked. You ever see someone? If there's an explosion, the ear gets unbalanced and then you actually lose your sense of gravity. But what I hear what you're talking about is this kind of, system crash. I really think that I'm surprised there aren't more. There's artists who are focusing on viruses and stuff like that, which always makes me a little wary. And hackers. I mean, of course, I'm sure many of you know about Snowden, the Snowden incident with the NSA and surveillance, and Julian Assange, of course. But I'm surprised that we haven't had more. So yeah, if you're talking about digging into the earth and finding the layers of civilization, like you're saying, that's soot. What happens when we start digging into the roots of information? And I think that's where you're going to be seeing a lot of artists looking at the next 5 years of data. There have been people like Tim Berners-Lee, who's considered to be the inventor of the web. They can't even find his first web page because they didn't think anybody would want it. And this summer I visited CERN, which is this huge particle collider where they needed better ways of organizing information and made the web. But Tim Berners-Lee, they didn't think anybody would want it. And so the to software that I used 2 years ago. And then software from 2 years ago wouldn't even talk to software that I was using 5 years ago. So, yeah, you have to start thinking about archaeology of the present. You can ask, don't be shy. If anybody wants to argue too, you can say, hey man, why bamboo?
It's really complicated something to remember. A year ago I went to Borneo and I met Iban people. They told me about the rock forest and I hung out with longhouses and stuff. So I learned a lot about the jungle and how it just changes continuously. Every step you take is a new environment. So I started thinking about jungle music and having a rave in the jungle. And now that we have Coachella that's fully sustainable, doing that in a place that is, digesting people continuously like the jungle. And I was thinking also about cannibalism and how they've been fighting cannibalism for like centuries. My interest actually only went to the point of the beat that would be necessary to maintain or to like promote positive influence onto the jungle using just like a party or a rave with the people in it just to, end cannibalism because, I saw an orangutan head that was shrunken and I know that's like a sin. But I didn't realize it until I had already left the longhouse, which means that I survived, I guess. So understanding that or that epiphany was really intense and music is something that changes everyone. So, in your studies through Antarctica and the world and stuff, have you found a beat that could cause this kind of a change?
It's funny, there's no universal rhythm. I think everything is fragmented and everyone will have their own rhythms and their brain and the neural system and the heartbeat, everything that we put together, the heart and the mind. Each person has their own approach, which I celebrate that.
Yeah, but I was imagining if you were in Antarctica, you were probably listening to what was there or maybe the whales underneath.
Yeah, wind, the sound, ice, stuff like that.
Yeah, but maybe there would be, and since you found geometry there's geometry in the jungle, there has to be some sort of a way to figure out the beat for each space in the jungle. It could be definitely mapped through, GPS.
Yeah, can I get the projector for a second? I just want to show you one thing. One of my favorite composers is a guy named David Tudor, and he did a piece called Rainforest. But I also want to show you this year's Burning Man did their theme based on cargo cults, which is from Vanuatu. So people were building crazy structures. This is the Burning Man robot, and so they built these kind of crazy stuff based on Vanuatu, easily enough. So there's always different layers of permutation. Probably most of you know about Burning Man of curiosity. Yeah. So they build this huge robot over, again, wooden and bamboo structure, and then blow it up. And
George Clinton was there.
Yeah, George Clinton with the mothership connection. So that's it at the end. And so yeah, cool. It's totally wild to see how one of the most remote parts of the South Pacific would then influence one of the biggest, most high-tech festivals in the U.S. So cargo cults during World War II were meant to be these objects that people had seen, the great silver birds flying overhead, dropping cargo for the ships and for the soldiers. The Vanuatu people then turned that into a religious impulse, a way of thinking about the jungle and tribe and all this stuff. And now it's a huge rave. So it's kind of wild. I love pointing out these paradoxes, but when you talk about the jungle or when you talk about the city, there's always this paradox of place. Like, if we took a jungle and dropped it in the middle of a city, if we took a city and dropped it in the middle of the jungle, that's where the sense of remixing and changing of space and time, because, yeah, sure.
Burning Man is in the desert. People go there, they blow up rockets, they do a bunch of fun stuff, but humans don't live there.
In fact, it's meant to be a temporary city that leaves no trace. That's the point.
So when I was thinking about the jungle is alive continuously. The desert is alive sometimes.
No, the desert has ecosystems. It's very active. There's a lot that's going on. It's just that we might not think of it as the same kind of ecosystem. But there's desert ecosystems without question. But I think that in general right now I'm really interested in terms of my own art of looking at complexity and celebrating complexity, because the U.S. really tries to get to a reductionist model on a lot of things. And so by doing that, by simplifying the world, what they'll do is then be able to contain it, sell it to you, and reduce it to its core components. So I think sampling plays with memory, plays with complexity, and then uses that to generate, I think, real cultural capital, which is, I think, the way people kind of don't want reality to be so standardized. This kind of stuff I find charming, but it's also just bizarre and paradoxical, and there's this magic realism at work. It's it's just it's very amusing. I can't believe in the middle of a desert in 2013, all these kids are bringing computers and doing all this stuff. Look at it says, who is John from? And John from, 2013 was linked to Kahn called Vanuatu. So the paradox of place and technology. This is a very high-tech festival. People build architectural renderings. They do these crazy, massive, crazy structures that are very complex. And these are things I just want to point out as a paradox. I wasn't there. In fact, I was in Vanuatu when this was going on. So, but I have friends of mine sending me JPEGs while they're walking through this huge festival. I'm on a small island in the middle of the South Pacific. So I thought this was quite a paradox of modern life. I'll leave it at that. I don't have an answer. I'm just,
I was really interested in a little side comment you made, which was about the standardization of rhythm. And I was just wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about that, because I've got sort of conspiracy theories of my own. But especially maybe whether it's just rhythm or whether it's just tempo that you're talking about.
Well, quantized. That's what they call quantized rhythms. It's here. Actually, can I get the? Sorry, I'm going to keep asking for the projector. You might as well just leave it up. I'll just show you what a waveform is, and that'll give you an idea. Say, for example, for my own app, I noticed that people need to see a visual version of a rhythm, and so you can just go to the samples area, pull that up. You can pull in different, and then you have the sound form. Like if you're doing the rhythms, you can easily see it automatically breaks everything up into small components. So the eerie thing about being able to break up sample clips is that there's a mathematics of it. When you say sampling, actually it comes from the mathematics of a small fragment. Like when you do the census, for example, they don't count every person. It's a data set. So this is essentially a data set right here that I've just taken and made a small loop. So you have loops and layers, so you have bits and pieces. But the problem that I find right now is specifically about tempo structures and 4/4 rhythm. I don't know if it's why everyone plays hip-hop beats in 4/4 or why everyone plays techno in 4/4. It's the way it is. But at the same time, that's what the vernacular is that works for people. There's probably a lot of psychoanalytic stuff into why 4/4 rhythm. It's probably Doug might be able to answer better. Doug, what do you think? Why 4/4 tempo is the global kind of vernacular right now?
I have no idea. I'm more interested in arrhythmic. You were talking about heartbeat. I was listening to a news thing on Radio National. Who had this doctor from Tufts University talking about this rare condition when if you're hit with a baseball in the chest, you can be killed instantly. And it's only because if you're on a downbeat of a heartbeat at this sort of microtemporal level, and you're hit at this one particular spot. It's like, kung fu, really good kung fu movie, the one vulnerable spot. But it all had to do with this like incredibly specific rhythmic thing, this rhythmic complexity and just the sweet spot on it. But yeah, I think what you're saying is that they're not even doing that. The 4/4 stuff isn't even doing a heartbeat. It's not doing the variations within a heartbeat. It's just
it's a relentless specific structure. But for me that's okay.
Some people can dance to a dot matrix.
You could. Some people have. The beautiful thing about rhythm is that you seek, presence and absence. So if there's a beat and then the absence of a beat, you're automatically playing with space and with, absence. I think that's okay. It's just I'm intrigued. Probably the book hasn't been written yet why we're so interested in this kind of idea of reduction to certain rhythms as we get more and more into a technological age. You would think, given how complex technology is right now and how complex our society is, our music should be wilder and more, just all these different directions. But in fact, it's getting more and more and more compressed in very specific patterns.
I'm interested in that whole issue of complexity, and I think that because I think it's very important with your project as well. We have to acknowledge it just to start with that we've moved beyond modernism, postmodernism into the age of contingency, to use Jeremy Till's terminology, and endlessly in this continuous moment of contingency where we're making architecture and all things that never become, they're always in a state of becoming. I think that's the age that we're moving into, and the exercising control, the idea that we have control, the idea that nature, we're above nature, or there's some religious construct, it's over. We're in this contingent moment. We're continually reacting, we're continually becoming, and we accept, I think, in this period, or this next stage, not to be in control. The idea of being controlling nature is over. So the age of contingency, I think, is fundamental, and that speaks to complexity. And modernism won't die. It still wants to control. It still wants to reduce. It still believes in essence and reduction. And I just think that that's over. I think our project is very much about exploiting complexity and dealing with endless contingency, which is what nature is in the end. It's not in any way static. It's as aberrant as we are. It's a fucking mess, really. And it's just the only real definition that works is it's a tendency towards equilibrium. And I think not only is its moment over as a construct nature, but also the idea that nature is beautiful is also very much over and in our way.
So what is the modern sublime? That's where I think the idea of the sublime, you got to remember what drove so many painters and artists in the 19th century, this idea of beauty, this idea that human beings could contain and conduct beauty. It's now, it's noise. Everything is noise. But I love that. I think it's amazing that we live in such a complex time where human beings have had such an incredible relationship to the planet, but it's eerie because you give people tools, you give people ideas, you give them every possible way to kind of do something different and interesting, and they're all going to go back to the normal default. Normal's so boring. But
the 4/4 on the rectangle are taking a long time to die. We have to fucking kill them.
I've always wanted to actually pick up on a question you asked Doug before, and then lead back to just to make a comment, and then to lead back to a question I want to ask. You're asking about why we're getting this, or somebody else asked you, why do you think we're getting this reduction down to 4/4 and more sort of standardized beats? I tend to think it's actually more about the development actually of a lot of these the way these types of software have changed over the last 10 years, in that a lot of them, I think, are dealing with a European culture in a way that doesn't really have rhythm built into it. Within a lot of European cultures, we're taught to clap our hands till we're 5, and then these people go to music class and these people go away, so that we have a technology that tends to auto-suggest all of the applications. If you look at the different versions of them the last 12 years, they develop the auto-suggestion of rhythm is actually built in a lot more strongly as it goes along. And it's a scenario I find interesting that like some more left field hip hop in the last couple of years, if you look at the influence of someone like Jay Dilla, that you're getting actually a movement away from that, where people are starting to actually play percussion pads more as percussion instruments and not using quantization. So I find it interesting there's actually a bit of a split in electronic music where you have one branch of it, the sort of the techno branch of it, using the technology more to auto-suggest the rhythm, while in hip hop you're getting a movement away from that. That was when you asked Doug, I would have said that, but just to lead back to a question, I want to pick up something you said earlier where you said something about the art world not understanding beats, and that part of something you found in your own practice was that you had trouble sort of working strictly within a fine arts world, using rhythms and things like that. I was wondering do you think that like when people look back at the late 20th century, they'll start to actually look at these things not so separately? It just seems to me that if you look back at the 80s and 90s and you look at early hip-hop and the practices of appropriation there, that a lot of the ideas of remix that came out of that were very similar to a lot of the visual art that was going on in the fine arts world. Barbara Kruger, appropriation within groups like Grand Fury making art during the AIDS crisis and things like that. I mean, to me it seems that there's a lot of rewriting to do of history here, that actually rhythm and hip-hop, if you look at the late 20th century, they actually are, there's a lot of correlation with what was going on in the art world at the time that's maybe not recognised yet.
No, I totally agree. I mean, the interesting thing about what you're saying is that I don't know if they would be aware of one another. Like your average kid probably would not know about Barbara Kruger, and Barbara Kruger would probably not know about one of the most wildly avant-garde Jay Dilla mixes or something. On the other hand, I make it my point to know both. But I work with like Barbara Kruger. In fact, I did a sound system. I'll just show you. This is a project we did with Eric Fischel and Barbara Kruger, where we took a whole bunch of her phrases and made a sound system mobile. It was really fun. But the problem for me is not necessarily that they're separate, because they aren't. It's the perception that they're separate. And the perception these days is quite powerful about the way the art world will deal with rhythm or not. So this is me DJing from a sound system that Barbara Kruger wrote. That's me DJing over there. And it's Eric Fischel. He's a major sort of painter. We had Barbara Kruger's truck pull up, put the sound system in front, and all these people were hanging out. This was a big happening about a year ago. So, the art world versus the music world, I don't think that they're separate. I just think that the specifics about people being aware. And you'd be surprised, the art world, everyone has a lot of politics and a lot of bits and pieces about how they think of criteria of judgment and criteria of competence. So if a painter doesn't know about turntables, I'm not going to critique that. If a turntablist doesn't know about making a sculpture, that's okay. But for me as an artist, I like to be aware of different things. And this is a fun map. I'll just show you really quickly where these guys took, actually that's me there next to John Cage, down from De La Soul, and they remixed the map of London with all the different styles. Although I think they gave DJ Shadow a little too much love there, but this is some of their work.
That's like the George Jonas genealogy of fluxes.
Yeah, so you can see a lot of different people. Although, I think it's kind of fun that I'm next to the like Beach Boys and transferring it RZA, if you look at the top. So good sense of humor always gets run through these sort of things. So, by the way, everything I'm showing is freely available from my website, including the books, the sound mixes, the movie, and so on. They're totally into open source. So.
I'm just curious in terms of since your practice has been engaging with climate change, what type of spectrums and modelling you sort of subscribe to in terms of the work going on with IPCC and whatnot, in terms of the scale of temperature increases, sea level increases, and whatnot, and what you see your role of your practice is in responding to where you sit in the status of that as a sort of urgent issue?
That's a great question. The issue for me is all about creating better literacy. And I think that you got to remember coming out of an American context where we have a lot of climate denial and the Republicans are very right-wing. They really, really don't care about anything. I mean, just it's incredible. Like, but with Sandy, for example, it's hard to argue with a storm that just smashed your house. I think that music can help reframe some of those issues, but it can't just do it alone. People need better information. They need better access to this kind of data in a compelling way in their everyday life. And I think above all, the issue is that music makes it more emotional. It makes it more of like a catalyst for change. So it's one component for me. It's not my only major thing. On the other hand, I'm highly influenced by people like Tim Flannery's book. I've worked with 350.org, which is Bill McKibben. He has a great book called The End of Nature. And I think that there has to be a core sense that people are stakeholders in the environment as we know it, which in the U.S., again, I'm coming out of a downtown New York model. The U.S. has so many paradoxes. I mean, we have smart people and we have idiotic people like Bush, or then you have people who are really passionate about the environment like Bill McKibben, then you have to deal with ExxonMobil or like Enron, all in the same place in the same country. But if they have legions of lawyers, legions of people being paid millions of dollars to say that there's no climate change, how do you fight that? I don't have the same budget as Exxon. So what I'm thinking about is that you can leverage cultural capital. You can leverage, I think, where people generate real value between people. I think if you were to say that I need a real concise update of what I think my music or my art or my writing is for, it's tools for thinking. Like get people thinking that you can do something different. Because the U.S. right now is totally hyper-standardized. So maybe one more question and I wrap up. It's been a great session. I have one question for everybody. If we're going to probably do this artist residency, would people be willing to come out to Vanuatu? Okay, all right. So that's a good sign.
I'd just be interested in what do you think about, in terms of materials, actual materials. It could be argued that carbon fiber is another one of these accelerators, a synthetic, of course. But we can do things with that. I've started building myself some projects, but the codes, of course, haven't caught up with it. It's incredibly strong, and boats and ships can use the technology. But if we can actually extract carbon in a particular way from the atmosphere to make carbon, like we can at the moment, I think we make the actual fibers from the refuse of the oil industry. It's kind of irresistible that there are, if you solve that equation of finding the carbon from the atmosphere, putting in the carbon fiber, we build everything with that. And that's another kind of bamboo moment in a way. So it's a bit of an irrelevant thing. It's kind of irresistible to carbon fiber.
That would be amazing. I mean, I think that there's so many ways that we could reuse.
It's about the only material that kind of innately is better at tension than even bamboo.
Let's do it.
So the Tour de France is like a research project.
Exactly. Yeah. Well, when you see your push bikes in the bamboo, which is a fabulous project, it does run parallel with carbon fiber, so they're kind of talking to each other. But that invention, which I don't think there's enough discussion about in science, of how you actually get atmospheric carbon into fiber,
I bet you
hasn't been invented, apparently.
I can imagine maybe 20 years from now, if they have nanofiber particle capturing stuff out of stuff like that's being made, they can actually extract, like metal from the air or, any fiber materials. You have printing, 3D printers that you could just print stuff from the air, just right on the spot. It might sound magical now, but look at Nikola Tesla. He's one of my big heroes, and we're just getting to powerless charging now, and he already did it almost 100 years ago. So, I visited Thomas Edison's home a while ago, and his light bulbs don't need to be changed. It's amazing. They have the same light bulbs that were there almost 100 plus years ago, but they built in obsolescence because they would make more money selling you more light bulbs. So people, I think industrial design can speak to the these issues in a very, I think, innovative way, and I have a firm belief that humanity, if pushed to the edge, which, I mean, there's a tremendous amount of problems with overpopulation, with diminishing resources, the oil economy cannot last much longer, et cetera, and just...
About self-fulfilling music,
maybe. But I do want to just say one tiny last thing, which is, I can't encourage you guys enough. If there's something that you thought was fun or interesting, feel free to remix, sample, rip, mix, and burn